Hi, I'm Ian McGregor, and I'm here to tell you about a project I've been working on for about 25 years now, and it's called the Canadian Museum of Making. And a long time ago, I used to work in machine shops and welding shops, and whenever I saw something cool that somebody else was throwing out, I'd put it in the back of my truck and bring it home. And so you can imagine over a 25-year time period that stuff mounts up pretty good, and my junkyard was getting really full. And so I came to the conclusion that I was either going to have to just let it rust into the ground, or I was going to have to figure out a way to display it. And so that's what this is. We call it the Canadian Museum of Making, and it's a display of what I think are really cool objects from the Industrial Revolution primarily. And then we also have a great collection of primitive African metalwork that tells the same story. There's two reasons for putting together a museum like this. The first and most important one to me was I get to meet a lot of really eccentric characters who come and are interested in seeing my stuff. And they've all got their own stories, and most of them got their own collections. And so it's really interesting to talk about them, because in some ways we're all kind of extreme at the sort of, tail end of the probability curve. So the second thing I'm trying to show here is there's an important interface between engineering and art. And really the only engineering objects that survive, the only functional objects that are going to be here 100 years from now, are things that look good. And I think it's a sort of something that most of us engineers lose when we design things, especially today. We're trying to figure out how we can make them work really well, and we're not so concerned about how they look. All of the things in my collection are here because they look good, or because I thought they were looking cool, or there was something really interesting about them, but it was primarily appearance related, not functionality. And so the message I'm trying to illustrate with the collection is that if you're an engineer and you want your things to survive, it's really important to think about how they look. And that will make people want to keep them around and not destroy them in the future, and there'll be a message that you leave behind. We're in a really beautiful location here. It's kind of where the prairie runs into the Rockies, and we're in the transition zone, and things are really beautiful. We got really sort of unique vegetation, climate, and scenery. And when I started thinking about building a museum, I wanted to make sure that I didn't have some ugly museum buildings sort of getting in the way of the scenery. So we made the decision to put it underground and to keep all things. So we're standing on top of it right now, and I think it's cool because you get to see what's here without really knowing there's a museum. So it's like a secret when you come to see it. Second thing that was important to me was that you couldn't sell my stuff off after I wasn't here anymore. And so it's all designed so we put all the stuff in and you can't get it out. We poured the roofs on after the stuff was put in, and it's there forever. And I think it's going to be like the pyramid someday. So let me take you in and show it to you. So if you're interested in objects that are made from metal, or the machines that are used to make them, you have to gravitate towards the Industrial Revolution, because that's when really interesting things started happening. We often forget that there was an earlier industrial revolution in Africa, and I see a logical connection between the first industrial revolution in Africa and the second one in Britain. There were very similar things that happened. We made things from metal, or man made things from metal, and those things were primarily functional, but they were made in a beautiful way, and eventually they evolved into some kind of ceremonial object. So the things in this room are from the African Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution represents a really interesting time if you're a collector of metal objects. It starts with things that were human or animal powered, then moves to things that were water powered, and ends up with things that were steam powered. And every time there is a war or some type of conflict, people think about how to make those machines better, faster, and do more things. So many of them I've collected over the years that are in this part of the museum here. So this is a linotype machine, and it's used in the printing process where you make a linotype at a time. And most people think that it's the most complicated machine ever made. And you can see it's got a huge number of parts. Letters sit up in here, and when you press on the keyboard, the right letter comes out of here, down through all these little slots, and comes into here, and eventually end up with a line of type here. Mark Twain tried to fund somebody to build one of these things, and when he was about 70, he lost his whole fortune. So he was one of the most popular authors in America, and he spent all his money in the world trying to get a linotype machine to work. And he went broke and had to go back to work, had to go on the lecture circuit when he was about 70 to recover the money that he lost. So I'm really interested in it because it's such a complicated thing, and it was a real sort of triumph to get this thing to work. So I've always wanted to own a linotype machine because it's about the most complicated machine ever made. Started looking for one and found a guy on the internet whose name, he called himself Linotype Larry, and he had a bunch of these machines. And we made a deal for him to bring it up from Illinois and help me learn how to use it. And so unmet, Linotype Larry headed for Calgary. He got here, we made careful plans, and he was supposed to arrive about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I was supposed to have a full day to work with him and try and figure out the machine and learn how to use it and figure out all the things that might go wrong with it so I could fix them. But it turned out that he got delayed on the trip up here, and he didn't arrive till about 7 o'clock at night, and he absolutely had to be back in Regina for 6 o'clock the next morning. So that compressed our schedule down to about 3 hours. And so it's sort of equivalent, when he started the explanations, I sort of thought, this is like trying to learn about the space shuttle in 3 hours. You're just not going to make it. So after about a half an hour of the most detailed explanations on the arcane details of this thing, I couldn't take it anymore. I was kind of switching off. But we kept going, and after about 3 hours, everything was ready to go. And so Larry said to me, sit at the keyboard and think of a phrase that's really important to you, and we'll produce a line of type, and then you'll always have that phrase to remember this moment. Oh, that's pretty cool. So I thought about it carefully for a couple minutes, came up with a phrase, sat at the keyboard and typed it out, and was ready to press the lever over there, which injects the hot lead behind the line of type that's here. And so just as I was ready to push it, Larry says, duck! So I ducked, and a shot of hot lead came out of here and went over my head. And to Larry, that was no big deal. He just said, sometimes that happens. You got to kind of watch out for it. Me, it was kind of like a little bit scary. So a lot of the good things that have happened to me in my professional life are the result of being able to work on really large, complicated, difficult projects, and to approach them with a single-minded sort of commitment to them, and with the certainty that I can get to the end. And I think that I learned to do that by doing a project that involved a 1931 Buick. So when I was 12, my mom and dad bought me a car like this, and we had a bargain. The bargain was I wouldn't ride on motorcycles, and they'd help me fund the restoration of a car like this. And over the next 4 years, I took the car completely apart. We didn't have a heated garage, so I hauled all the bits and pieces down in my basement, rebuilt each one, took it out to the garage, put it back on the car, put it all together. And eventually I drove the car for a couple of years when I was in high school. And I sold it when I went to university because we needed the money to afford the tuition. So what I learned on this is that, I think I learned at an early age that if you just start doing things and you keep after them and keep grinding away, eventually you'll have success. And you shouldn't be discouraged when it's difficult. You shouldn't be discouraged when things that you're doing are unknown. You should try and figure them out. And so that all comes, I think, from this car and my mom and dad's, supporting me in what was a big project for a kid. So this car is the same as the one I had. It's not the one I had, but it's the same as the one I had. And the best thing about these cars is the sound of the door.